The new hukou policy a real benefit or another political scam? This is Jersey News Commentary. On May 22, China's State Council released the opinions on promoting the provision of basic public services based on place of permanent residence. On the surface, this looks like a people-centered reform of hukou-related public services. Permanent residents who have not obtained local household registration may now enjoy more basic public services in their place of residence, including education, housing, social security, medical insurance, employment, elderly care, and social assistance. The document proposes protecting the education rights of migrant children, including bringing them into public services for preschool and senior high school education, including families without local hukou but with stable employment and residence into the public rental housing system, removing hukou restrictions for participation in employee social insurance at the place of employment, allowing residence permit holders to participate in urban and rural residents' medical insurance, and allocating schools, medical facilities, public housing, and other public service resources according to the permanent resident population. If we only look at the text, this seems like institutional progress, a positive policy adjustment. But the suspicious question is, why is it being proposed only now? China's urbanization did not begin today. Since reform and opening up, China's urbanization has gone through at least 3 stages. Around 1978, it was still under the strict hukou control of the planned economy. From 1979 to 2011, it entered a period of rapid urbanization driven by industrialization, export-oriented growth, township enterprises, and coastal opening. In 2011, China's permanent resident urbanization rate exceeded 50% for the first time. After 2014, the authorities proposed new type urbanization, emphasizing the urbanization of people, equal access to public services, and an increase in the hukou-based urbanization rate. At that time, the permanent resident urbanization rate had reached 53.7%. In other words, what is being said today was already known more than 10 years ago. In fact, it was not unknown even more than 20 years ago. Migrant workers entering cities, migrant children attending school, social security and medical insurance being fragmented across regions, residence permits having little real value. These problems have existed for a long time. They were not solved in the past not because there were no conditions to solve them, but because the hukou system itself was an important tool of China's low-cost industrialization and land finance urbanization. In the past, cities needed migrant workers' labor, but they were unwilling to bear the cost of turning migrant workers into full urban citizens. Factories needed workers. Construction sites needed workers. Food delivery and courier services needed workers. Urban service industries needed workers. But education, medical insurance, elderly care, housing security, and other public services were not willingly provided. The real function of the hukou system was to let people enter the city to work, but not allow them to become full urban residents. This was institutional exploitation, not a technical issue of administration. So why is the government suddenly talking about providing basic public services based on place of permanent residence? My judgment is that this does not mean China's urbanization has entered a golden new stage. It is merely a clumsy tailpiece after the dividends of urbanization have already been exhausted. Because the background has completely changed. First, real estate has changed from an engine into a black hole. According to data from the National Bureau of Statistics, in the first quarter of 2026, national real estate development investment fell by 11.2% year-on-year. The sales area of newly built commercial housing fell by 10.4%. Sales revenue fell by 16.7%. Residential sales revenue fell by 18.5%. Funds received by real estate developers fell by 17.3%, and personal mortgage loans fell by 34.6%. This shows that real estate is not experiencing a cyclical correction, but a systemic collapse of credit, population, income, and expectations. Second, demographic collapse is hollowing out the future of cities. In 2025, China had only 7.92 million births, 11.31 million deaths, and a net population decline of 3.39 million. People aged 60 and above already accounted for 23% of the population. Although the urbanization rate rose to 67.89%, this occurred against the background of overall population decline and continued rural population outflow. This means that the so-called increase in urban population is less and less a natural concentration brought by prosperity, and more a stock transfer under demographic imbalance. Third, the employment foundation is disappearing. Official data claim that the unemployment rate is around 5%. Who would believe that? The employment rate of university graduates is less than 20%. Many graduate directly into unemployment. For large numbers of young people, so-called employment means gig work, food delivery, courier work, live streaming, and the like. The key is that these sectors have already become brutally overcrowded. All gig work industries are saturated, and incomes are barely enough for people to support themselves. Therefore, when this new hukou and public service policy is introduced at this moment, we should not only look at the packaging of expanded rights. We must look at the fiscal and debt logic behind it. In one sentence, today's new hukou policy shows almost no visible dividend, but the effect of using hukou to fill holes is faintly visible. What do today's cities lack? They lack homebuyers. They lack people who pay social security contributions. They lack people who have children. They lack consumers. They lack people who can keep the urban fiscal machine running. In the past, migrant workers were cheap labor for the cities. Now, migrant workers and outside populations are being repackaged as new citizens, permanent residents, and domestic demand potential. In one sentence, in the past, you were not allowed to truly enter the city because the city wanted to extract your labor. Today, you are welcomed into the city because it wants to extract your savings, your social security payments, your medical insurance contributions, and your future mortgage. Of course, the so-called equalization of public services may bring partial benefits to a small number of people. For example, those who have stable jobs in Shanghai, Hangzhou, Shenzhen, and other cities, who have continuously paid social security, hold residence permits, and have children who need schooling may indeed gain some convenience in children's education, exam eligibility, and social security transfer. But the question is against the background of widespread unemployment and semi-unemployment, with stable jobs becoming fewer and fewer, how many such people are still left? Even if children without local hukou can take exams in big cities, what can that change? They get into college, even into 985 or 211 universities, and then continue to face unemployment, civil service exam competition, public institution exam competition, gig work, and low-wage involution. Some media outlets excitedly shout, blockbuster news, major good news, Shanghai changed overnight, and migrant workers are blessed. In my view, such claims are either stupid or deliberate brainwashing. The real question is not whether you are qualified to enter the city, but what you will live on after entering the city. It is not whether you can participate in medical insurance and social security, but how much money is still left in the medical insurance and social security pools, and whether there is still a share for you. It is not whether you can buy a home, but whether, after buying one, you become that foolish and ridiculous bag holder. What is even more worth noting is that if this policy is placed alongside several other recent developments, the logic becomes very clear. The Ministry of Justice recently announced that in its special campaign to standardize administrative law enforcement involving enterprises, more than 300,000 administrative law enforcement personnel nationwide who did not meet qualification requirements were adjusted or dismissed. More than 7,000 law enforcement bodies that failed to meet legal requirements were cleared out, and more than 400,000 unnecessary law enforcement items were removed. The official explanation is that this optimizes the business environment and standardizes law enforcement. But why were these people able to exist for so long in the past? Who authorized them to enforce the law? Who indulged them in issuing fines, conducting inspections, collecting fees, and sealing off businesses? Today's sudden dismissal actually means that the fiscal system can no longer afford them, enterprises can no longer be squeezed, and grassroots arbitrary fines have already backfired on the economy, forcing a major passive contraction and a shrinking tax base. Then look at another so-called blockbuster announcement from the National Development and Reform Commission. During the 15th five-year plan period, China is expected to invest more than 5 trillion yuan in building a new type power grid, including transmission channels, interprovincial power projects, ultra-high voltage systems, urban distribution networks, and rural grid renovation. Of course, this can be packaged as new infrastructure and high-quality development. But under the conditions of a stalled real estate sector, weak private investment, and insufficient consumption, the so-called six networks are essentially still the old method using big projects, big investment, and big slogans to create the illusion that the economy still has momentum. Therefore, the new hukou policy, the dismissal of law enforcement personnel, and the 5 trillion yuan power grid investment may seem unrelated, but in fact they all belong to the same political narrative, releasing a false signal that the government is reforming, the economy has hope, and society is becoming fairer. But the real underlying logic is a passive policy performance forced by fiscal pressure, debt pressure, employment pressure, real estate pressure, and demographic pressure. If the CCP had truly cared about the people for all these decades, why did the schooling problem of migrant workers' children drag on 4 decades? Why did cross-region medical insurance reimbursement drag on 4 decades? Why did hukou barriers drag on 4 decades? Why were social security transfers, housing security, and equal access to public services only brought out with such fanfare after the collapse of real estate, demographic decline, and the exhaustion of local finances? This logic simply cannot be explained. The only explanation that makes sense is this: when the people have use value, the system opens a tiny crack for them. When the fiscal machine needs them to provide blood, the system suddenly becomes warm and open. Therefore, the so-called provision of basic public services based on place of permanent residence cannot be simply dismissed as completely meaningless. But from a macro perspective, it is not a new dividend of China's urbanization. It is a remobilization after the old dividends have been exhausted. It is not a generous expansion of public services, but a blood replenishment project after fiscal revenue, real estate, social security, and medical insurance have all been bleeding. It is not an awakening of institutional conscience, but policy packaging forced by crisis. In one sentence, this is not the city finally opening its arms to migrant workers. It is the urban machine slowing down and reaching out to the last group of people who may still be mobilized, charged, made to buy homes, and pushed into consumption. So, is the new hukou policy a real benefit or another political scam? Think carefully. My answer is, for a small number of individuals, it may be a minor benefit. For Chinese society as a whole, it is more like an institutional patch delayed by several decades, and for the CCP's fiscal machine, it is a new blood-drawing tube. What we truly need to be alert to is not the pleasant words it says, but why it is saying these pleasant words precisely at this moment.